This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host, Richard McColl, here in Bogota, Colombia. Our very special guest is up in Texas, in the United States right now. We're going to be talking to Tony Payan, PhD. He is the Claudio X Gonzalez Fellow in U.S.-Mexico Studies, the Françoise and Edward Dirigion Fellow for Mexico Studies, and the Executive Director of the Claudio X Gonzalez Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Additionally, he's the Professor of Social Sciences at the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez in Mexico. So welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure. And of course, this feels like we're hot off the press with recent events taking place in Mexico. Perhaps, Tony, we could start. Let's just start with what happened this past Wednesday in Mexico.
Yes, the Southern District of New York federal judge essentially went through the process and indicted, at a minimum, I believe, 9 politicians in Mexico. A prominent senator from the Morena party, which is the current governing party in Mexico, and of course the governor of Sinaloa. There's about 9, 10, 11 names on the indictment list. Clearly, the U.S. government already made a request for extradition. The foreign minister in Mexico, Roberto Velasco, and a couple of other folks are already kind of pushing back. That obviously touches on the nerves of the governing coalition. These are very central figures to the movement that was founded by Mr. López Obrador way back in the day, and of course eventually won the presidency in 2018, and now Sheinbaum is the president of Mexico through that movement. So she's up against the wall. I think Carney up in Ottawa and Sheinbaum in Mexico had taken very different tacks in dealing with the Trump administration. Carney was a lot more aggressive, more vociferous. I think that was his strategy. And obviously Canada is now trying to diversify its relationships. Sheinbaum took a different tack. She tried to placate Trump. She made concessions on immigration. She made concessions on security. She made concessions on tariffs on China. So she's been stepping back. Every time he pushes, she just simply steps a little further back. But placating Trump is very difficult. And you give him an inch and he asks for a mile. And so he is now pushing for Mexico to turn over these guys. Now, I understand where she is at this point, and I also understand what Trump is trying to do. One of the major promises that Trump made was to fight organized crime in Mexico, because organized crime in Mexico directly affects U.S. interests. It affects U.S. companies operating in Mexico. It affects drugs crossing the border into Mexico. And of course, we saw the scandal with immigration. So anything that happens in Mexico has a ripple effect in the United States. That's clear. These two countries are very integrated. They're neighbors. So it is of great interest to Washington that what happens in Mexico has to be dealt with. And honestly, Mexico had gotten out of whack. I don't mean to be too rough, but it seems the evidence is kind of coming up that Morena, the Morena party, to be able to get into power, created a huge electoral and political coalition that seems to have included very questionable figures, and in fact, some pacts, probably implicit and some explicit, with organized crime. And I think that's drawn Washington's attention. Johnson, the ambassador of the U.S. to Mexico, went down there with a very clear agenda to fight not just organized crime. We saw an incident in Chihuahua where the CIA was involved, but also to ensure that he begins to clip the ties between organized crime and the governing party in Mexico. And this is just another move. And so it puts Sheinbaum in a very difficult position, because now she has to begin to cut heads from her own party. And that's not going to be easy. That's going to fracture her coalition. So fine. So it is. I think it's good for the U.S. I really think it's good for Mexico. Nobody was going to make that step, take that important step in Mexico. And I think now Trump is forcing Sheinbaum to do it. She's going to have to decide in the next few days, weeks, what she's going to do.
Yeah, I fear by the time that this episode comes out that things will have moved on so far. We broadcast always on a Tuesday, and this is a couple of days beforehand. But if we think of the governor of Sinaloa, amongst others, Ruben Rocha, who has obviously now been implicated in all of this and the connections to the Sinaloa cartel, there are possibilities of similar outcomes in other states around Mexico as well. If we think of the Jalisco Nueva Generación, the New Generation Cartel, there are other. Does the Morena party have connections with others possibly?
Yes, because these connections are local, right? Different cartels, organized criminal groups operate in different parts of Mexico. The Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación operates in Michoacán, in the state of Jalisco, obviously, in other states within Mexico, in central Mexico particularly. I think they're very strong there. I think the governor of Michoacán, Bedoya, may have some connections with the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. Some mayors are actively involved with organized crime. You may remember when El Mencho was killed in an operation in western Jalisco, in a small town there. There was the media, not the government, the media came up with a payroll list. And in that payroll of the cartel were a lot of mayors and Congress members and politicians from the Morena party that were all receiving money. They, in the state of Sinaloa as well, where Jalisco Nueva Generación clearly was in a fight to death with the Sinaloa cartel, and the Sinaloa cartel fractured within itself. They were also buying alliances in that state. And then let's go to the state of Tamaulipas, where Americo Villarreal, the governor, is also being accused by the United States of collaborating with the organized crimes. And I don't think those three are the only governors. There are quite a few other governors, senators. One of the most critical alliances, I think, between organized crime in the government is, of course, the Senator Adán Augusto López, a protege, a longtime friend and ally of Mr. López Obrador, and possibly someone who negotiated campaign finance support back in 2018 or even as early as 2006. So that coalition that's governing Mexico is rotten. Let's just be very clear. I don't have any sympathy for Trump. Don't mistake my words for any sort of sympathy for what is really a thug occupying the White House in Washington. I want to make that very clear. But clearly, the Mexican governing coalition is rotten to the core. And I think that if Sheinbaum resists Washington's pressure to get these guys to New York to be tried, and obviously to provide additional information, which may unravel the coalition even more so because there are so many people involved. We have already seen in Venezuela, and we've seen it with El Mayo Zambada last year, that U.S. operative and the CIA in Chihuahua, the operations against these labs in the mountains in Chihuahua, we've already seen that the U.S. has the operational capability to go in there and take them. And that would be an even greater scandal. And that's what puts Sheinbaum in a very difficult position. Imagine if the operatives from the U.S. dashed into Mexico and then took one of these governors, then they can do it. They certainly showed that they were able to go into Caracas and take Maduro, and they were able to go into Sinaloa and have Mayo Zambada, a very important figure, handed over to them, and then landing in Santa Teresa, New Mexico. The ability to do that is there. And so Sheinbaum either begins to figure out who she's going to turn over, or have the U.S. CIA and other operatives flying to Mexico and take them out. And that would be really an awful spot to be, more so than where she is today.
It's one of those things you feel that she was doing, perhaps President Sheinbaum was doing enough to placate Trump. Let's say the capture of Mencho, killing of Mencho, capture of Mencho, Nemesio Oseguera, and then, of course, a few days ago, I want to say Audias Flores del Jardiner, and then it gave her a little bit of a space to be able to push back on those CIA operatives who lost their lives up in Chihuahua and didn't have the right to be there. And now, obviously, well on the back foot. How do you feel going forward then will be what's the next move for Sheinbaum on this?
Yeah, she's really between a rock and a hard place. She could potentially negotiate with Trump and begin to hand over minor figures. I think, although Jardinero is obviously not a small fish, she could potentially say, I'll send you this guy, and I'll send you that guy, and I'll send you that guy, and try to prevent the extraditions from reaching the very higher levels of her governing coalition. And obviously her mentor, I'm sure that Mr. López Obrador, retired out in Palenque in the jungle out there in southeastern Mexico, is probably not very happy because he, I think, advised her. Probably an important strategy that worked for him was essentially to say, look, I'll stop immigration. I'll get all these Central Americans and South Americans and all these people. I'll stop them on the border. I'll deport them. I will prevent their arrival at the U.S.-Mexico border. I will solve the problem for you if you just leave me alone. And it worked for him between 2018 and 24. And during the first Trump administration, I think Trump was relatively satisfied to resolve the crisis at the so-called immigration crisis at the border. This is not going to work for Sheinbaum because the border is shut. Immigration is fairly under control, well over 95%. It's only a trickle now. It's a sealed border. Nobody's going to go across the border without authorization. So that's solved. And I think the next step was going to go after drug trafficking. It was one of the major promises that Trump made in cleaning out Mexico, because we have to understand that in Mexico, organized crime is facilitated by politicians. This is the one thing that I think is really very different, because in the past, before 2018, those of us who looked at organized crime in Mexico, we used to think, oh, this is a business. They're doing business. It's a black market. It's drug trafficking, but they don't really have any political interest. They may buy a chief of police here and there, so they operate in relation to the state in ways that facilitates, but they're not really integrated with the state. What we saw with Morena in Mexico is that now the lines between government and organized crime are blurred. We don't know where one ends and the other begins. And so we have essentially a narco state of sorts, not in general, but in many different places in Mexico, and certainly the Morena coalition, well in cahoots with a lot of these criminal groups in different places. And so it's very difficult to know. And I think the strategy of placating Mr. Trump by making concessions was transferred over to Sheinbaum. Like I mentioned, she imposed tariffs on China. She continued to stop immigration or transmigration through Mexico. That's not going to work. Trump wants big fish, and he's going to get them whether she wants or not. So I bet you that there's a lot of strategizing in Mexico City. Unfortunately for Sheinbaum, she's also facing another problem. She has an election in 2027, and it's coming up in about just over a year, 14 months from now. There'll be an election in Mexico. Her coalition seems to be fracturing. There's a lot of people getting in place to compete for the seats in Congress and governorship. 17 governors are going to be elected in Mexico out of 32 states, and lots of other positions. And so everybody's vying for position. There's groups, a bunch of tribes within the Morena party, and you can see already that there's a coalition is fraying, and then its own political allies, the Green Party and the Workers' Party, are beginning to scurry away because they were threatened with a electoral reform that would leave them out, essentially, would make Morena a hegemonic party, and they would not be able to participate actively or substantively, even as members of a multi-party coalition. So all these problems, political problems, are only going to get worse over time. And then you got Trump putting pressure down on the president. She's got a huge problem. And the next, I think, 12, 14 months are really going to be essential in Mexico. Something's got to give. And I think Sheinbaum is a tough spot.
Tough spot indeed. And when we were discussing almost like the complete penetration of this organized crime and this blurring of the lines between government and organized crime, but given the money and given the spread of organized crime, whoever else gets in, likelihood there's going to be connections as well. It's not as if you turn the page in 2027 after an election. It is such that the corruption, the money involved, and the violence will ensure that this continues. So we're going to see both sides, the US continuing to pressure and put let's say, what do they put them on, the most wanted lists and as criminal groups or designated terrorist groups, right? And so on to these cartels. You just don't see a light at the end of the tunnel for Mexico in this moment in time.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that Trump did that was crucial in this and articulating the pressure on Mexico was precisely what you just mentioned, which is to declare these criminal organizations in Mexico terrorist organizations. What that allowed the United States to do is essentially to concatenate a number of previously isolated strategies into a single broad strategy to maximize the pressure on Mexico. Now the Treasury Department went after financial institutions. We saw 3 institutions fall in Mexico. One of them, by the way, accused of money laundering for organized crime, that Vector, it's called, that was the financial institution of Mr. Romo, who was the presidential advisor, the chief of staff of the López Obrador administration. And so that it went that deep and that high. That institution doesn't exist. Banco, whatever that bank was. And then, so the Treasury Department is putting pressure on the financial system. The Justice Department, DEA, FBI, they're certainly coming after specific individuals, weaving the investigations on the coalition and the members of the coalition and governors and mayors and senators and on. And then the Homeland Security Department, HSI investigations, doing some groundwork, preparing all these different, all the evidence to be presented in court. And then you have the State Department, which is now withdrawing visas from individuals. Again, the governor of Sinaloa, Ruben Rocha, had his visa canceled about a year ago. It wasn't made public. It was just made public this week when he was accused formally by the U.S. government. But we've seen many mayors being detained at the border as they cross into the United States. We've seen people being denied their visas. And we saw that the elites in Mexico, which are very prone and kind of traveling into the United States, are now being detained for investigations at ports of entry, whether it's by land, by air. And so the State Department obviously castigating the Mexican elite. So now they're traveling to Japan and Spain and other places to show their new money. They're almost like a corrupt nouveau-riche political class. And then, of course, the Pentagon jumping a bit to get some operations, drones and others. And, of course, the CIA, an independent agency, actively running ships and drones, gathering information within Mexico. So the pressure is at a maximum today. We've never seen that before, but that's clearly a consequence of Mexico's own lack of cooperation. Mr. López Obrador was able to prevent all cooperation, practically kicked all the DEA agents out of Mexico, and then gave a carrot in return, immigration. That's not working today. But everybody's hands are on this one strategy by the United States, coordinated strategy across departments and agencies to exert maximum pressure on Sheinbaum. And that's where we are today. And I can assure you, we haven't seen the end of it. This is just the beginning. We're going to be really busy in the future to see how Sheinbaum responds, both at her fraying coalition at home, an important election coming up, lots of policy mistakes that she's made over time, and of course, U.S. pressure. And of course, the renegotiation of the USMCA, which also gives Trump enormous leverage over Mexico because Mexico is so heavily dependent on access to U.S. markets and capital. So the upper hand is evidently with Washington today. Again, not an endorsement of the Trump administration. I think they're awful. But hey, it's like with Maduro, right? You can accept both. That it's a good thing for Venezuelans that Maduro is gone and that Trump was wrong to do it. I don't know why people sometimes do this bifurcation and they say either or. It could be this and that. Both of them could be wrong, and yet you don't have to have any sympathy for Maduro simply because you don't like Trump.
Yes, it doesn't make you a Maduro supporter that you didn't want U.S. intervention on the South American main. I can understand that. Talking about intervention on that, we know that obviously the CIA very clearly have been involved in clandestine operations within Mexico. What kind of probability do you see of actual open operations of U.S. forces, let's say? From where I'm sitting here in Colombia, obviously huge amounts of cocaine that leave the country, and then we've had probably up to 200 people killed on these small boats that have been leaving Colombia, or fast boats or so on, allegedly, and so on. What kind of probability is there that the Trump administration, under the Secretary of War and so on, might start bombing boats leaving Mexico?
There's a couple of things here. Let me take it in layers.
Yeah.
I think the first option that she's being given is hand them over, right? That's the ideal, that she begins to make these offerings and take these guys and put them on the sacrificial table and say, look, I need to avoid a major crisis. I need to renegotiate the USMCA. I need to clean up the house. And so some of them will start handing them over. It'll create a lot of problems with her mentor, López Obrador, who's probably still very much involved. She says that she doesn't have a red phone, a direct line to Palenque, where López Obrador is retired, but I think she does. And so I'm sure that they get on the phone just about every day, and she's getting advice from him every day. And so that's going to create a lot of political tension. But that's the choice that Washington is giving Sheinbaum. Here's the folks that we want. Whatever happens to your coalition is not of concern to us, right? So that's number one. The second is, I don't think that the probabilities of a direct intervention in Mexico are just a bit lower than they were perhaps in March or February, because I think the U.S. is now engaged in Iran. And the Pentagon is quite busy with that. They're spending a lot of money. They're asking for more money. They're running out of weapons out there. And the operations in Iran are taking all the attention, sucking in all the air. And there is also elections in Washington coming up. And I think the Democrats are going to do very well. And so they're going to really put a lot of pressure on the Trump administration, which in my view is quite a corrupt administration. And the Trump family will come under scrutiny. So they're going to be very busy. But it doesn't mean that the U.S. bureaucracies, which have a life of their own, don't already have very specific operations in place, a repertoire of things that they can do. We saw what they did in Chihuahua with the collaboration of the state authorities. And I believe the knowledge of the federal government. I don't buy the idea Sheinbaum has been lying, and everybody in Mexico, you just don't know what the truth is. It's the same in Washington. You just don't know what the truth is. Everybody manipulates reality and tries to interpret what's going on for you. But I don't believe that the Mexican government didn't know of the CIA operations in the state of Chihuahua or other places, right? But they busted this huge laboratory up in the mountains in Chihuahua, and there's still CIA agents died because of a traffic accident. They just went off the road in this perilous mountains, and clearly that's how we knew that the CIA's deep in there. It's probably not the only operation. I'm sure that Omar Garcia Harfuch, the Secretary of Security, knew about that. The CIA agents, they're going to come in, they're going to do what they're going to do. They're going to take the people they're going to take, they're abscond the individuals that they're going to abscond, and they're going to bust the labs. They're going to do it because Mexico is a little bit reluctant to cooperate in direct intervention and invasion type of operations on the ground, this kind of thing. No, I think the probabilities are lower, but agencies are agencies, and they have their mission, and they have their plans, and they have their standard operating procedures and their programs, and certainly their operations, and they're going to continue to implement them more aggressively with the help of probably opposition. We saw it. It's not a strange thing that the state of Chihuahua is governed by the PAN. And the PAN has been known to dislike organized crime and to have fought organized crime aggressively. This is what escalated the violence back in 2007 and on. The opposition figures in Mexico see themselves under siege, and if they have to resort to some help from the U.S. in their territories, they're certainly going to cooperate.
Almost private agreements between state and international. And does all of this then? And I have to, this points to another thing. All of this is handing over and the captures and, of course, these politicians implicated. Does this strengthen the rule of law in Mexico or likely to trigger more violence?
I don't think the rule of law in Mexico can be any more compromised. if you look at what's happened in Mexico, they have essentially dismantled the judiciary. A lot of these judges are also participating in organized or facilitating organized crime. They're now siding against folks. There was a period where the judiciary in Mexico expanded Mexican citizens' rights. Now we're in a contraction period, and many of them are compromised. Half of the judges are still to be elected sometime. And now Morena itself, which reformed the judicial system, is saying that it's such a bad reform that is not working, that they should postpone the election of the other half of the judges to 2028 instead of 2027 to fix the law that they passed, because they realized that it was so bad and so many incompetent and perhaps even compromised individuals were getting into the judiciary that they now needed to fix the mess they made. So that's completely gone. The prosecutorial system is completely bankrupt. It's not working at all. There's no real evidence. There is no trials. There is no real intention to really, from the executive, to really go after bad guys. And obviously, if they're part of the political coalition, much less. And then violence is high. The government is trying to hide a little bit and make the numbers a little bit better by reclassifying deaths and murders, and extortion is going up. People feel unsafe. We often think that the murder rate is the only thing that matters. No, the violence and extortion and kidnapping and theft, property theft, and things like that are the hijacking of trucks in Mexico is up. So businesses are operating under very difficult conditions. All that is going on. So let's not kind of fixate on the murder rate because it's being papered over a little bit. The violence continues. So can it get worse? I'm not sure how it can get worse. There are places where people just cannot circulate. They can't travel. They cannot do business. It's very difficult. A family was just killed in Mexico City this week because they failed to pay extortion. And there was a message left there. You didn't pay, you all die. In Mexico City, right? So when that kind of violence touches the capital, which is relatively safe, and they try to keep it as an island of safety, public safety, is touched by that, then you know that there are many other places in Mexico where this is just not working. Congress is completely co-opted. There's almost no articulation in efforts on public safety between governors and the federal government. So how can it get worse? I'm not sure. The rule of law in Mexico is broken. And let's not even talk about the fact that many of the reforms that they've made do not just guarantee a good administration of justice for Mexicans, but they also create a great deal of uncertainty for investors and businesses. So can it get worse? Possibly, but goodness, it's very difficult to figure out, to argue that this can certainly get worse. Yeah,
it makes for very uneasy listening and, of course, reading about this. And I thought when you think of, obviously, the criminal element and the organized crime, this is not just a domestic issue, obviously, in Mexico. It's an international issue. And you want to be able to say to Sheinbaum, and I'm sure that she's strategizing right now, how can she point at domestic successes? She can't even point at the economy, really. Why does it continue to underperform? It's everything.
We just published an article it's called Locked in Low Gear, Mexico's Struggling Economy. You can find the paper on our website. And the reason why I thought about that paper is because I said, look, the Mexican economy is in trouble, but it's not just one of those passing troubles that things are bad right now, but the fundamentals are good. And then we're just going to eventually the crisis will blow over, much like a storm over Houston. And that'll be the end of it, and the economy will recover. No, there are some very important structural issues in Mexico. Productivity is falling. There's very little investment in R&D. The education system is in shambles, starved. Public universities under siege and really not being provided with the resources. The infrastructure is not being maintained. We see a lot of problems with the bridges and roads and public transport and airports and ports. They're just not there. The investment is not there, and they don't want to open it to private investment. Mexico could prosper enormously if all these things were just be open to private investment. The country would have stellar infrastructure, but they don't want to because their idea is that the government should control all that. Then there's some white elephant companies that were created or projects that were created by López Obrador, and Sheinbaum has insisted in maintaining, like the Mayan train and the airport and the airline, all of them losing money. And now there is practically a government that's broke. Half of Mexico's foreign debt in the last years has been acquired by the López Obrador and the Sheinbaum administration, which tells you that the fiscal position of the country is tough. And of course, if you get to over 60% of GDP foreign debt, you may lose your investment grade, which will create just a very unattractive environment for investors around the world. And she doesn't seem to be able to fix this. Inflation is still very high, castigating especially the poorest, because the poor use a lot of their money for the basics, food and fuel. And that kind of inflation is certainly way, way higher than the 4.7, 4.5%, whatever it is today. It's in the 20s and 30%. Eventually, I think the cash transfers the government is making to folks on the ground is not going to be enough. That's going to be eaten away by extraordinary food inflation. We continue to depend. The energy sector is not open. So structurally, I think the economy is just in trouble. But instead of opening it to give it some oxygen, they're closing it. And so I think that is getting Sheinbaum into a pickle, all of their own making, right? These are all things that they came with and they believe in. They don't have to be that way. There are lots of opportunities for Mexico to prosper, to become a real powerhouse. They just don't want to. So it's up to them.
The roots, as you say, the roots run deep into the Morena, let's say the Morena history in the country. López Obrador, obviously President Sheinbaum. I know that we have to wind this down, and while we're talking of investor uncertainty and, of course, the large informal sector in Mexico, can we see a way forward? As final comments here from you, Tony, can we see a way forward for Mexico, for Sheinbaum?
I think she's going into her she's already well into her second year. I don't see that she's going to take control of the situation. She's truly committed to an economic and political model that's not going to pay off. It doesn't make the country freer. It doesn't make the economy better. The only way forward is going to be up to Mexico's citizens. Mexico's citizens have to take action in the ballot box. They have to come to the ballot box and figure out who are the candidates that are offering a better future. If they don't do that, if they continue to sell their vote for a cash transfer every month or every 2 months or whatever they receive, 5,000-6,000 pesos every so often, if they continue to be not citizens who exercise their right to vote effectively, but rather clients of the Morena party in exchange for these cash transfers, then the country is just going to hobble along. I think it's up to Mexico's citizens. They really need to step up to the plate. There are options. There are other political parties. There will be other candidates. They have to figure out how to say no to Morena. That's the only way out. I don't think Sheinbaum herself, in the position that she's in right now, surrounded by the problems that she's surrounded, can easily break out in any time soon.
Thank you for that. Troubling times certainly in Mexico's. So let me say thank you so much to Tony Payan, PhD. He's the Claudio X Gonzalez Fellow in U.S. and Mexico Studies, the Françoise and Edward Fellow for Mexico Studies, and the Executive Director of the Claudio X Gonzalez Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, also Professor of Social Sciences at the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez in Mexico. It has been an absolute pleasure. Perhaps not so happy news about Mexico, but news we need to share and news we need to tell. Thank you so much for sharing such profound insights into a situation.
Thank you, Richard. See you next time.
See you next time. I've been Richard McColl here in Bogota, Colombia, your host for the LatinNews Podcast. We'll be back in a fortnight's time discussing more issues and stories from the region. Remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and beyond, and never miss a future episode. Thank you. Bye-bye.